going to open up the floor to some more questions, but I just will, from British Gas. The kind of change of use of social media for you, having moved from an agency side to the client side, how important is it? How has it changed the way that you look at the way that you communicate at Gas, British Gas?
If you work for an energy company and it's a debate about trust, you definitely shouldn't sit in the front row. It's the learning for me. I was just sitting here enjoying my beer, and but anyway. Good question. I mean, the reflection I was having overall and what everyone was saying was total agreement that the whole trust thing is about what you actually do. To the thing about you don't crave trust, you do the fundamentals right to get the trust, and that in turn, I think my reflection is that it is all about leadership and culture. So if the top guys are authentic about that and taking the long view that they're going to do the right things to earn that trust, then the rest of it sort of takes care of itself. So I think Johnny's right that maybe the kind of social media use to date in the energy industry and other industries like banking, where people have been sort of craving the trust and we've been through that phase, is that sometimes it can be ill-judged because people sort of at the same time fear it and want it to be a panacea, and neither really works. And to Steve's thing, I think it's when you start to go, we'll have a grown-up conversation based on principles and actually what we're actually about, and we'll open it up and it's not a gimmick and it is what it is, then you'll probably start to make the right steps forward. And then to the thing about, do the chief executives tweet or not, I think again to the authenticity thing, it's sort of like if they feel comfortable doing it, then it'll probably work, and if they don't, it probably won't. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think the sort of maybe the hysteria a bit around social media is beginning to die down, and maybe the hysteria around trust is beginning to die down, and people are starting to go, it's just about the way you do business, and people will get to a better place as a result of that.
Thank you. How many people tweet? Put your hand up. Marketing. Who's got a question?
Hi, Branwell Johnson, Marketing Week. Benny, I've read Descent into the Maelstrom. We'll have a chat later. My question is, we haven't discussed millennials yet, the millennial generation. Does the panel think that it's more difficult to get the trust of the millennial generation? Are they more cynical or not?
Are they more cynical? What do you think, Alistair?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think they're probably better informed. I don't know that they're necessarily more cynical, but I do think they're better informed than their counterparts would have been at that age 20 or 30 years ago, with access to more information. And I think they've certainly been encouraged to be influenced by more different forces than we would have been at that point in time. So I think it means that it probably is more challenging to get their trust, or maybe it's easier to lose their trust. I think they're more connected to more sources that could allow them to question what you've done. So probably is more challenging, as much because it's as easy to lose as it is to gain. And maybe they start off they don't start off in a neutral position, where probably when we were that age, we probably did start off in a more neutral position, would be my view.
Benny, what about from...
Yeah, it's funny, we had a board meeting today and we were talking about this very subject, and I don't think I've got enough hard facts to be able to reach a firm conclusion, but my suspicion is that, and I mean this in the broadest sense, I think that millennials are going to be more promiscuous with brands, more promiscuous with employers, and I think it will be, that in that sense the world will be a different place. I think the nature of the digital sort of environment we'll live in will make making choices and switching from supplier to supplier different, and I do think that they're likely to swap. I don't think there's going to be far fewer people who spend a long time with one employer. We're seeing that already. You hire somebody, you spend 2 years, invest a lot in them, and then they move on. That's fine, because you can't fight the tide. But I think my best guess is it will be different.
What about from advertising communication point of view?
Yeah, I mean, to the point we were saying also about what happened with social media, this is a generation for whom it's natural rather than something that we've all, or I don't say we all, older people like myself have tried to get to grips with, and I've got teenage children for whom doing what you describe is absolutely natural, you know, before they book a holiday for 300 quid as my 18-year-old's doing to some miserable place. He's, you know, gone through 1,000 different stories of despicable things that have happened in this place in Greece, but he can't afford to go anywhere else, so that's where he's going. But that's his.
Maybe you just
Or
want to
why
do those
he's
despicable
But
things, Johnny.
that's the norm, and I think, you know, so having that kind of access and openness isn't something that, you know, is a second thought. It's a first thought. I also think it's an interesting thing to that thing about, you asked me, do I tweet, and is it natural to tweet and whatever. And I guess partly because of what I do for a living, I sort of felt I had to. But the first people to pick up when I have sent some relatively boring tweets straight back was the first tweet I sent was about some, you know, point of view we had on brands or something, and a bit like Steve, it's like, you know, because I haven't become head of a football club, no one gives a shit anymore. But as we put this thing out, I literally had within seconds my son and his best friend tweet loser, double loser. Just like, you know, straight back, and I sort of looked at it and thought, they're not wrong.
Yeah. What happens with millennials and football? Is it a father-son thing?
Yeah, often.
Still.
I mean, it changes when you get in the Premier League. I mean, it's very much a father-son, father-daughter. You know, it's very more family-orientated these days. I think in terms of the cynicism, I think that's a really interesting one, because on the one hand, I would say yes, because there's so much information around. I think to your point, you can lose trust, and people are more, they can go and find bad stuff out about people or things a lot easier. But then again, I look at young people and I see a trust in and a belief in weirdest things nowadays, you know, like Apple, you know, for example. I mean, you know, this in the end, Apple are just a company that try and sell us stuff, you know, it's good stuff, but there's this incredible trust that young people have got in technology companies, and also in things like fame, you know, and very vacuous things that they seem to, you know, there's a lack of cynicism about Kim Kardashian that frightens me to death, you know. I mean, I look at them and I wish they were more cynical about some of these things. So I think in the end it probably hasn't changed. I think there's a cycle, and because banks and corporations to some extent have been found wanting in an open environment where you can find out more about people, that you know, they'll have to sort of smarten up their acts. Other people have been better at playing it for years and are more in tune with modern society and know how to play that cynicism, if you like, to their advantage. So I think the landscape changes very fast with modern technology and modern forms of communication. The only thing I would add about Twitter, by the way, the thing that fascinates me is that for all the followers that you get, and I've spoken to people who've got far bigger followers than me, friends in football have got 2-3 million. It's actually a relatively small percentage that tend to be engaged, really, in following you. I think it's quite overblown in terms of the reach that you can get sometimes with social media. If it's not interesting, it will wither on the vine on there.
It's interesting though, Steve, that I read something the other day. Henry Winter, the sports writer in the Telegraph, has more followers than the Telegraph circulation, which is a single kind of. It's just, it's quite astonishing, really.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Questions?
Alistair, hello. My name is Jim Goodwin. I work for a charity called the Royal British Legion. In terms of your brand at McDonald's rebuilding trust, about 10 years ago to the day, Morgan Spurlock wrote a film or produced a film called Super Size Me, which was the 18th highest grossing film of its time. What interests me, I don't want to put you in a difficult position, but what I do want to know is how McDonald's and how you guys rebuilt that trust, given the fact that that film had such a seismic impact on a key audience at that time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that film in itself, I guess it gave everybody all the headlines that were floating around the business and put it all together in one place, and it kind of said, yeah, there's everything that's wrong with McDonald's in one go. And you know, for us in the UK, that was a particularly big moment. Actually, as big a moment for us in the UK as well was what was known as the McLibel case, which again was you know, the way that we'd handled that was, you know, it was really trust damaging in itself, it was kind of a combination of all of those types of activities that led us to say, actually, that we're not doing this right, and we can't market our way out of it. This isn't about an advertising campaign. It's not about trying to tell a story. This is about real fundamental change. And the only way to work out what that real fundamental change needed to be was to get closer to our customers. And like any good marketing story, it starts with the customers. It starts with understanding what mattered to them and then systematically putting things right. In reality, we had been making seismic changes to the way we did things for 4 going on 5 years before we were ready to start talking on television about the changes we made, because we had to do things fundamentally different. Having started to do them differently, then we were able to engage with our stakeholders more deeply, to talk to them about it, to understand what they wanted, get closer to our customers, understand what they wanted, and gradually move people along a position where they were ready to hear us telling them a little bit more. And even when we told them a little bit more, it wasn't about giving them a whole lot of facts, because actually, why would they want to listen to a whole load of facts from McDonald's? It was about telling a story in an emotional way that mattered to them. And for us, the sort of changes we made, had to go right back to the food first of all, because that was what really mattered to people. Obviously, making sure we were 100% British and Irish beef, making sure we knew exactly where all the meat came from that went into the burgers. Changing all of our eggs to free-range eggs. You talked about investments. These for us were huge investments at the time. There wasn't an immediate payback on those things, but they were things we had to do because they were what mattered to our customers. We had to make sure that we were treating our employees in the right way. And also we had to continue to do the things that always mattered to McDonald's. Things like our investment in the Ronald McDonald's Home charity for families when they're in hospital, making sure that we continue to do those things. But whereas before we saw things like that as well, if we did that, people would trust us. We realised that was just part of our story, and it was the fundamental parts of everyday business that had to be changed for those things to matter at all. So it kind of went right the way back there. It meant changing a lot of stuff. It meant the whole organisation aligning behind a vision, which for us was to be a modern progressive burger company. It meant doing all the things that were required to make that happen, and then talking to people about them in the right way, and all the time giving as much transparency as we possibly could, allowing people to see things. In 2006, a big movement for us was launching what we called Make Up Your Own Mind. Bear in mind, in 2006, Facebook really wasn't doing an awful lot, so there wasn't a lot of social media around. That was us launching a website that allowed anybody to ask any question they wanted at McDonald's. For us in the McDonald's world, that was a huge, huge step. And we were out there at the time using search just to find out what questions people were asking. As soon as we saw them asking a question, we were serving them the Make Up Your Own Mind website to try and get them in. And the questions we got were, it was a really good view onto just how bad things had become in customers' mind. From people questioning what the crew at the front counter put into a milkshake, as much as what was happening to our beef burgers. And when we talked to customers about the fact the fish in our fillet of fish was marine stewardship approved from sustainable sources, they said, "What? You got real fish?" For me, as a one-line wake-up call, that was as strong as it got.
Yeah. Benny, you were at RBS before, weren't you?
Yeah.
Did your experiences in other banks, were there certain things that you thought, when I run and start Tesco Bank kind of from scratch, although it wasn't exactly, but could you go, I'm just not going to do that?
Yeah, first of all, I spent 9 years at RBS running retail, RBS retail and NatWest retail, and it was a fantastic time, and I've worked with fantastic people. I would never deny that to be the case. I spent a short, unhappy year at HBOS thereafter, before I joined Tesco to set up the bank from scratch effectively. In my time when I was in the kind of conventional high street banks, what I would say is that the people who were on the phones and the people who were in the branches did their level best to serve customers as well as they could. I don't doubt that for a moment. And I think that the organisation was culturally set up to get in their way. So too many people in the central functions, whether it was marketing or product management, was trying to work out how to, through obfuscation or just opaqueness, just do things to customers so when they look the wrong way, they get punished. The big appeal to me of setting up Tesco Bank was that Tesco did want me to put Tesco's values into banking in the UK. And in the last 5.5 years, our greatest achievement, I think, has been that we have created a culture where genuinely people are trying to do their best. Now, it's a bit of a kind of random walk. You can't just leap to one position unilaterally where you just do everything that customers want. The way I always explain it to colleagues in the business is, you know, if we were to do stupid things and go out of business, we wouldn't be serving anybody. So what we've got to do is be sustainable and doing the right things for customers. And I would give you sort of 3 examples of what we've done very briefly to illustrate it. One is, as soon as we took full control, we removed all sales targets and sales incentives for colleagues who were dealing with customers. Because in my opinion, it's not that someone couldn't put forward an argument that sales targets and sales incentives can work, because you can make an argument about anything. I think it's ineluctably corrosive. I just think it leads to a bad place. And it's what lay behind mis-selling a PPI. It's what sat behind so many different things. So we did that. And I'll tell you, the managers have to work harder because they've got to work out how to manage people. But that's their job. And I can also assure you that in our major centres in Newcastle and Glasgow, people who have worked in financial services all their life think it's a much more hospitable environment, focused on doing the right thing. It's something they can be proud of, because you get what you measure. And if you measure sales or add-on sales or whatever, that's what you get, and you get bad customer service. The second example would be in our kind of sponsorship investment in the community. I have no interest in sponsoring operas or sponsoring, you know, ballet or whatever else is for bluntly kind of middle class people that can afford to go themselves. What we do is we invest in kids, and we invest in an inclusive way. And anytime anybody comes to talk to me about investment in either broadly sponsorship or the community, I just say, you've got to prove to me that it's going to help young people and it's going to be inclusive. Doesn't mean it's only helping disadvantaged people, but it cannot miss them. And I think that has been an enormous cultural kind of catalyst within the business. Another example is something that I had nothing to do with, but I think is a great symptom of a business that's doing the right thing. When the Cumbrian floods took place about 3 years ago, some of the people in our insurance business said, on top of just dealing with all the claims well and in a timely fashion, why don't we give every single person who's lost their home temporarily 500 quid in Tesco club card vouchers? And I got letters from people who just thought it was a wind-up, you know, because we were sending out a letter saying, here's a bank that sent you 500 quid, just saying, I hope this helps. And people didn't believe that it was, I mean, people were saying, I thought it was a wind-up.
And how difficult was that to get Tesco to agree to do that?
Well, I just agreed as soon as somebody recommended it to me. I didn't ask anybody. I mean, no, I mean, it was, no, actually, the amazing thing here isn't that I said it was a good idea. The amazing thing for me is that culturally, we were making people think about putting customers before the P&L. I didn't even ask how much it would cost. In the end, I found out it cost us about 40 grand. But who cares, you know?
Yeah.
What a 40 grand to spend.
Yeah. Steve, is there any sponsor that you wouldn't accept money from for your club?
No.
I had lots until you said the word money. Yeah, there are. I mean, we certainly, as a community club, as a club that are definitely an integral part of the community, I don't think that we'd go for a payday lender. I personally don't know enough about it to take any particular position. I'm sure there's an element where they fulfil a service, and I think it's probably just an area that needs proper regulation rather than banning. But I think it would be, again, it wouldn't be very authentic. It wouldn't be us. I think right now we're wrestling with the whole betting thing. The fact of the matter is, with football, the money that there is for sponsorship is things that can be easily activated while the game are on, where they can measure them. That's where they'll pay the most, So, if you've got Bet365 or 1-2Bet or whatever on the shirts, they can measure the people that are signing up for accounts, and they can monetize that. And there are things around. Most of the people who are interested are either betting or wallets for betting, or things that are associated with it. So. You can't put that on the kids' shirts, so it's not great. So we're certainly wrestling with that. We would prefer. It's a balancing act of disadvantaging yourself competitively, which none of the fans want, against your peer group, and doing the right thing. And of course, you've got a large percentage of people that want to bet in the stadiums and they want a betting partner and all that kind of thing. But obviously, that again, it speaks to everything. And a football club, I mean, for us, you know, for the first time I've been involved in something where I've written it down. You know, what are we? What do we mean to people? You know, everybody needs something they can fall back on. In those moments of crisis, I think, are the times where you're most likely to start acting irrationally and doing things that, you know, aren't particularly you and you shouldn't do. And I think that's the time where you really need something that says, hold on, or a body or a group of people. And I think it's about, people are learning that you need to be emotionally involved with your business. You know, you can no longer just take a profit, shareholder return position. You know, you need to become emotionally involved with it. You need to identify with your customer base, understand what drives them, not just what they want or what they say they want, but what drives them in their everyday lives, even what you think they might want that they don't know they yet want, and really understand them. And in that way, you know, you can deliver the things that they want. And the problem is, when you get into that, it's very hard. Because it's really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. Johnny, are there any clients that you wouldn't work with?
Well, it's interesting because and I was just thinking about that. You know, in our case, you start an ad agency and you set out, which was 3 of us, to say, well, there are some things we wouldn't do, and we had quite a healthy debate about that because we came from different ends of the political spectrum, and then you have, you know, arguments about whether or not you would advertise cigarettes, and we pretty much decided, I think, when we started, that we would advertise anything that was legal other than cigarettes and weapons. But then what's interesting is you then get to 2008 and the world falls on its arse, and then you have to just take a quick check and say, oh crikey, we need to, you know, things have gone a bit rough, and somebody calls up that you might naturally have said, oh, we wouldn't, then you think, oh, he's starting to have a conversation. The thing that helps us is, helps me a bit, is we're a partnership structure, so 50.1% of our business is owned by the senior partners within it, so I run more of a collegiate organisation than a directed one. So on things like that, I put it to the partnership, you know, and say, how does everyone feel about this? And, you know, as everyone knows with me, I'm up for pitching for most things, but I often get set back by these guys saying, I don't think we really want to do that. And I might even be a bit annoyed about that in the short term, but actually over the longer term, to that authenticity point, people feel better about having had a say in that and saying, no, we don't want to do with that, and we may have forgone a bit of income here or an opportunity there, but actually this is more true to what we are. But I have that sort of fallback of it not being my decision.
So you can borrow some values.
I borrow the good values of the other good people.
There's a question here.
Michael Mushinsky, I'm the founder of London Advertising and also chairman of Wordio, which is a new social media app. So I'm going to appear very old-fashioned by actually defending the advertising industry. And we heard earlier that 17% of people only trust advertising today. I'd be very interested in the panel's view as to whether actually that can be trusted. I joined the industry at the same time as Johnny, and I remember surveys showing how advertising was so low on people's decision-making process. I think it's more to do with how the questions asked, and I think also there's a general issue of what is advertising. Is it a message on a shirt, or is it a tweet? Is it a poster? So I think actually advertising's day has not ended. I think we've got a great future, and I think that clients make, you know, rational decisions, are intelligent people who spend billions on advertising, and we shouldn't let, should we say, parts of the research industry do it down.
So you didn't have a question, you just wanted to say...
No, the question was, does the panel believe the 17% figure to be accurate?
Oh, okay. Well, do you believe it to be accurate, and we know how much you spend on advertising, and it is important for you.
I'll answer the question I'd rather answer, I think.
Go on.
If the research says 17%, the research says 17%. But I don't think it's down to 17% of people trust advertising. At the end of the day, it's not the advertising you trust; it's the brand that sits behind it. And if you know, one brand tells you in an advert one thing, you'll believe them, and if another one tells you something else, you won't. You know, the fact it's on an advert doesn't make it believable, doesn't make it unbelievable. And maybe that's changed over time. Maybe there was a time in the past where somebody who could afford to advertise on TV was immediately seen as trustworthy because they must have been of a certain scale to do that. But now I think it is very much about the brand. I guess you could have more fun answering the question, is the advertising industry trustworthy? But maybe this isn't the place to have that conversation.
Oh, go on, Benny, you were going to say an answer. Is the advertising industry trustworthy?
Is that the question?
No, but we
No,
asked the
I don't
question
think
I'm
it was. That's
asking
the one
you
you're
now.
asking me, right?
Yeah.
Well, look, I don't think there's an absence of trust. It's the question of it's kind of competency rather than trust. Sorry, wrong room. I think all these surveys and all that. I mean, I have to say I've spent a whole day today listening to survey results about so many different things, and I'm not sure I believe very much of it. At the end of the day, there's a lot of bad advertising. I think there's a lot of stuff that's not very effective. But I think good advertising has to reflect, as Alistair said, the essence of what you stand for. And if it's good advertising, which Neil Christie's doing for me just now, good advertising reflecting the values of what you really stand for, and establish that trust and belief and bringing the right things to customers' attention, then it can work. But I think the numbers are kind of irrelevant, to be honest with you. Does that mean it could be that 17% advertising is quite good and the rest of it's rubbish?
There's one here and then one behind.
JP and I are both Fulham fans, so it's a question for Steve. And apparently, JP was saying that the last 33 clubs that have been relegated from the Premiership, 4 have come back one season later. What would you do if you were chairman of Fulham to try and bring Fulham back in a season?
Well, he probably...
That is the question, isn't it, Steve? Steve said there's going to be some questions about football that are completely nothing to do about trust, but I'll try and answer them quickly.
Yeah, I did promise that. I mean, I think honestly, I think your owner needs to find a manager and stick with him would be a start point, wouldn't it? You know, I mean, if you the concept of that you get a manager. I mean, there's this great joke going around about Daniel Levy at the moment, isn't it? That they know that he's definitely getting Pochettino because he's already looking for his replacement. Fulham took that one stage further, didn't they? Because they got a manager, and then they would get the next one sitting in the stands, sort of watching each game, and then, I think you know, he's got a lot of money. The guy, it's a great club. I think if he gets some stability and he leaves the most difficult thing for all of us who are used to being hands-on in every single part of the business, the most difficult thing in football is, you have to accept. I've never been a professional footballer. And he's never been a professional footballer, and he needs to find somebody he trusts, ironically, and leave the business of football to them, and I'm sure you'll bounce back quickly.
Can I just say one thing, because the only member of the advertising industry sitting on this panel when it was big.
Yes, sorry, it was very
my
unfair,
attack
John.
is just, as anyone who works in advertising knows, because of regulation and else, it's very, very hard to lie in advertising. So anyone who's ever tried to get something patently untrue through, the authorities, it's incredibly hard to do. I think the reason that the 17% trust is actually, the ads that consumers see aren't for them, they are for campaign readers coming from Ogilvy and Mather or CHI or whatever, but for the real world, they're coming from British Gas or RBS or Tesco, and I think that is a reflection of the trust breakdown that's happened, as I referred to earlier, across all the major institutions, because they let, consumers down. I don't think advertising agencies or the advertising industry is guilty of that, and I think one of the, I'm sure we're guilty of lots of things, but one of the things that it's very hard for us to be guilty of is to tell things that are, untrue in advertising. I think the only thing that does lead to further mistrust is where there's an issue for a brand that's so patently staring the customers and the country in the face that they decide to talk about something else in advertising, Will and I've had these debates, if people are cross with British Gas and the energy industry about prices, that's probably less the time to talk about something else you're doing, because there'll be a period of time where people just say, no, I'm accusing you of this and I want to talk to you about this, so don't try talking to me about, that. I think that can lead to further mistrust.
And actually, I agree with you on that. I think that it's very easy to not talk about the thing that is the most important, and particularly from clients. And I wonder whether it's because it stares you in the face so much that you forget that it's actually the thing that customers really, really want to know about. So, the Super Size Me bit, you kind of all knew that was what was going on, but nobody wanted to address it. Or the issue with or even with Tesco, that you've forgotten about your customers. Everyone sort of knows that, but actually as a business, it's really hard to say that is the thing we're going to address because it's the most fundamental.
I think there's a question in there somewhere.
Well,
I don't think it's ever hard to address something that's fundamental when the customer's at the heart of it. I think the hardest thing to do is to change a business when things seem to be all right. And you know, I think when you look at most businesses who at some point have their performance has gone off the boil, it's because they've left it too late to address something that's emerging. Because actually the results are pretty good. You know, the profitability still looks pretty good, the growth is still looking pretty good, and being brave enough to say, actually, we need to invest now, and maybe we need to accept that we're not going to grow quite as much for a couple of years because we want to make some fundamental changes now that's going to set us up for the future. I think that's the most difficult thing to do in business. It's much easier when you're at the bottom of the pit and there's only one way to go. So that would be my thought.
Yes.
I do. I mean, I go back to something I probably said at the very start. I think that kind of hypnotic influence of success can kind of blind people. And I always remember when I was at Standard Life, I just joined the group executive committee. I was 32 or something, and the chief executive, a guy called Scott Bell, who was a fantastic guy actually. And we had an off-site, and it was probably one of the first off-sites at Standard Life. It was a kind of crusty old kind of company had. And he said to the executive, "So what do you think we should talk about today?" And I sort of let the baby in the class put my hand up and said, "I'd quite like to talk about why we think we're successful." And he said, "No, we're not doing that. Has anybody else got any other ideas?" But I actually think he did worry about it, but he just didn't want to share his worries with everybody else. But you know, I think the other thing I would observe, and it's funny, I had a chat with Alistair Darling, who's a bit of a mate of mine, and I was talking about my business experiences, and he was talking about the Labour Party, and he said, you know, I think he said it was about, in his now reflected opinion, the Labour Party lost it in 2005, but they just didn't know. And I think that happens to businesses. And one of the flaws in the analysis is that I think 10% of the decisions create 90% of the outcomes. And people, when they're succeeding, tend to start to think that it's everything they do that's just better than the competition. And it blinds them to the fact that they're getting some big things right. And there's a lot of other stuff that's kind of just hanging off it, really. And I think one could look at lots of examples of that. And it's leaning into the truth. But lean into the truth when you're succeeding, because you might avoid failure.
Yeah. We've got time for one more question.
It's Kavita Singh from the Ideas Foundation. We're a creative industries charity. And I think this question about advertising and whether our advertisers trustworthy really depends on whether they've grasped, in our experience, the market segmentation and the demographic change that has happened in the UK in particular. And I think that from what we're seeing, we try and get a diverse pool of young people into advertising, into the creative industries. And a lot of the times they say that they go to look in niche areas to find what is resonates for them, whether it be consumer brands, whether it be, you know, it depends on what kind of brand you're looking at. But I find that if a brand grasps this complexity of demographic change and segmentation, then I think they're more relevant, in our opinion.
Thank you. We've got one more question.
Hello, it's Helen Gunter from TJX Europe. I've got a question for the panel about the current advertising campaign for the European elections coming up, what they think about them and what can be done to build more trust amongst politicians and advertising in general on political parties.
Ooh, political parties. Well, let's start with Benny, because people hate politicians even more than they hate bankers. So we could maybe start with you.
And I'm Scottish as well. No, I mean, I must be honest, I don't think anybody who thinks that advertising is going to help the reputation of politicians very much. I think the only people who are going to help politicians is themselves if they ever get around to it. I have to say, I'd be very surprised if an advertising campaign could change one opinion. But I don't know if that was the question.
Johnny, you've worked on one political campaign?
Yeah. I mean, without sounding political about this, I don't think it can change the image of politicians at all. I do think people have to be careful that sometimes, as we've seen recently, advertising can spark emotions in communities, and funnily enough nowadays, more so by the fact that the ad doesn't really run but is just shown to a TV station. Because funny enough, when I worked years ago on these campaigns, the political parties used to spend a lot of money on advertising. Of course, now they do a controversial poster and then release it to unveil it to Sky News, and it actually doesn't run anywhere. It's very hard to ever see one, but it gets its own traction through...
You mean you can't make any money out of it?
Yeah, so I can't make any money, so I'm not doing it anymore. But I do think, you know, particularly if that is referencing, you know, some of the UKIP stuff, I do think we have to be careful about the effect that advertising can have in a negative way, in terms of the effect it has in communities and people. And I've quite rightly seen people, you know, offended by what's going on. So I think advertising can be very powerful as an offensive weapon in campaigns. I'm not sure it does a great job. In fact, funny enough, just one little anecdote. For when I worked with the Labour Party years ago, and it was on an election that needed no advertising because Tony Blair was going to win it by yonks, it was in 2001. And so the Labour Party came in to see us and pretty much wasted 3 years of our time in focus groups saying, look, Tony doesn't want to say anything nasty about anybody else because Tony just doesn't want to do that. And so what we'd like to do is just come up with a lot of advertising messages about, you know, how the world can be a better place and blah, 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 blah. And I went to the time our creative director was Trevor Beattie, and he'd done a load of election campaigns. I went to him and said, look, this is what they want to do. And he said, look, the truth is there's only one type of advertising, or two types of advertising you can do. We're great, and they're, you know, tossers. And no one will go to Politico's bookshop, and there is a Politico's bookshop, and then go through the history of all advertising in any country anywhere around the world, and you'll never see an ad that says either we're great or let's build a better place or that anyone can ever remember. The only advertising that anyone can ever remember is their tossers, and you have to do it in a way that makes people laugh and actually makes their own supporters laugh at their own candidates so they don't come out. So we took William Hague, who was in a lot of trouble anyway, so I feel a bit mean about this. I met him once since, and he said, I don't think I'd remember any of the advertising your agency did. And I said, well, I'm afraid you would. We once took your head, put Margaret Thatcher's hair on it, and wrote a headline that said, get out and vote, or this gets in. Did a load of research, and actually a whole load of Tories thought, oh yeah, he's no Margaret Thatcher. So I think it can have a nasty, my long-winded answer is, I think it can have a negative effect. To Benny's point, I agree, I don't think it can have a positive effect.
Steve, do you have a point of view?
I think if you're talking about the European elections, it's slightly different, isn't it? Because it's a polarising debate. You know, it's pretty yes or no, isn't it? And I think I have to say, unfortunately, I think the UKIP stuff got them a lot of coverage. You know, even if they didn't run it, you know, I think the rest of it. I mean, I saw a party broadcast by the Greens. It was the worst thing I think I've ever seen. Some of the party, who makes them? I mean, they need an advertising agency to make them for them because they're truly horrendous, most of them, aren't they? And I think they do more harm than good to every single. Did you ever make any of those, Johnny, for people? Did you ever help them with them? Yeah,
they were pretty awful, if I'm honest.
Before we then get into some sort of political debate, I think we're going to close. Thank you all very much. Just as my last question to you all, tell me a brand that you really trust.
Me?
Steve? Yeah.
Netflix. I
Why?
like Netflix. Because it's quite reasonable, isn't it? And, you know, they entertain you and they don't really ask for anything and, you know, I like Netflix.
Do you wish you'd closed it a little bit earlier?
I do, yeah. No, we like House of Cards. Got to be.
Exactly.
You can only get it on Netflix. Johnny?
Tell you what, the brand I was going to say was Ocado. There was one point I suppose we haven't discussed, which I know riles a lot of my clients that are non-online, which is say one of the ways to get trust from consumers is to do things that appear to cost you money. Now, you were saying earlier that, you know, we're going to have to make our stuff free range, we're going to have to da-da-da. And I think for lots of non-online businesses, because there's essentially free capital to these growth .com businesses, you do sometimes wonder if the basis on which they earn your trust would ever be profitable. So that's a separate debate about Ocado. So you think the amount of amazing things that Ocado do for me might be the reason why they've never made a bean. But they certainly do a lot of things that appear to cost them money that are for my benefit.
I like businesses like that don't actually make money. I always think, you know, Ocado, not only they're paying me to bring me food. I quite like that.
What brand do you trust?
I'm pretty cynical, really. I trust small brands, but anything else. For me, the one that stands out is very small. It's a small wine bag, or the wine shop brand called The Sampler. They only have a couple of outlets. And I trust them because Every 2 weeks, I get an email from the guy who runs it, and I believe it's written by him. I've got no doubt that just the language, the way it's used, it's written by him. He talks to me about what he likes. Doesn't tell me I should buy it. Doesn't try and push deals at me. He just talks about what they've got, the story that behind getting it. And you know, I believe it every time. You know, the fact that I've never pushed into it, but it just seems to be genuine.
Yeah.
You know, all those things about being genuine, being authentic, being real. And you know, I've never been let down when I've bought something he said he liked. And you know, he's honest about why he likes stuff and why he doesn't like stuff. And for that, I mean, it's a narrative that just makes sense.
Benny?
I'm sort of following Steve's lead here, slightly different, but Spotify, which I love music, and I have to say, I think the way it engages people and creates a sense of community and creates advocates, of which I am truly one, is, I think it's a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier on that you can't, it's difficult to share books, isn't it? But actually you can share Spotify.
Well, people
and
can
it
just
feels,
follow you, yeah, and people all over the world can. In fact, there's people I know that live in North Carolina who I met in London, and you know, they're following my playlist, I'm following their playlist, and occasionally we bump into each other, and I think it's just an amazing. If you like music, then it's hard to beat, really.
Yeah. So we know trust is about authenticity. It's about putting customer at the middle of everything that you're trying to do. It's about sometimes it costing you rather than just making money from it. It's about making sure you have some values, even if you're just getting them from the other people in an organisation. That tweeting is fantastic if you're the chairman of a football club, but is quite tricky if you're not. But I think we all agree that it is vital to the way that you build your brands now and your businesses, and it's something to really consider.